So one other announcement. On Monday, you're not going to need to wear masks for these kinds of meetings. So if you want to take your masks off, I'm not going to report you, and I will not let Rebecca report you. And it's about time, frankly. So in any event, welcome. Today's discussion is going to turn from the background of the American Revolution, which we've discussed the first two talks, to the actual events that lead up to it, and in a few more lectures we'll get to battles. But the interesting thing to talk about here is to look at the beginning of the conflict from two levels. The first we learned when we were kids in school, no taxation without representation. I mean, is the one phrase I think we all can realize that we remember. But that carries with it, as a famous American judge later said, that taxation really is the equivalent of power. And if you look at the dispute, which I'm going to begin to lay out in a couple of moments, please recognize that there were real issues about taxation, there were real issues about money, but something underlying them was the issue of power. And where did power actually reside? And where did people at the time think that power resided and where it ought to reside? So there's no question that we're going to talk about taxes, we're going to talk about money, but behind and underneath that concept is the concept that I want to bring out, the concept about where power resided. And so the issue begins with the great victory that Britain had at the conclusion of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Of all the British victories in its entire history, the greatest was this. And it was the greatest for a number of reasons. The British had fought against the French, the Spanish, and a number of continental countries, and in the beginning had great difficulty, but toward the end, in the last 3 years, overcame and destroyed the power of the continental powers, as most clearly exemplified by the conquest of Canada. But Britain also won confirmation of its control over the Mediterranean by controlling Gibraltar, took over the predominant role in the African slave trade, took a couple of islands in the Caribbean, and defeated the French to become the predominant European power in India. These, along with the subsequent developments of the British Empire in the 19th century, was the greatest victory that Britain ever had. But it came at a cost. It came at an enormous cost, because in some senses one could say this was the First World War. There were battles in the Caribbean, there were battles in India, in Northern Europe, in Africa, and certainly in North America. And the British paid enormous sums of money, far beyond any sums of money that had ever been raised in British history, to maintain the largest navy and the largest army in the world, spread over 5 different continents. So at the conclusion of the war, the British had this enormous victory, and concomitant with it was enormous debt. The government didn't raise taxes so much as it borrowed money. And with borrowed money, as you know, there comes the price of paying interest. And it comes the price of repaying the money when the debt is due. So the British were faced with the issue, where is this money going to come from? Where is it going to come from? Not only as a result of the war itself, but also as the result of maintaining the British Army in North America. Now, on first blush, one would say, well, why did the British retain approximately 10,000 troops in North America if the French had been defeated? The only other power in North America was Spain. But Spain's power was confined to Florida and what we would now call Texas and Mexico in the Southwest. It was not a threat by itself to British power, and it certainly hadn't been a threat when combined with the French. So in effect, there was no threat to British authority in North America once they had taken over Canada. Nonetheless, there were 10,000 British troops stationed in North America. Why? Well, there are different theories as to why. There still were Indian tribes out there that were threatening the colonists. They still were concerned about the French population in Quebec. But one of the most interesting theories, and one on which I subscribe to, is that they couldn't afford economically and politically to repatriate the troops to Britain itself, and particularly couldn't afford to discharge the officers who were of the lower nobility. To sustain British employment in Britain itself, they couldn't deal with 10,000 repatriated soldiers. So the costs of the war were not only the cost of the debt, but the continuing cost of keeping troops in America. The British, therefore, did what the British normally had done historically, with Parliament's approval. And just a little bit of a tangent, you may recall British history, and the struggle of much of British history was for the assertion of the power of Parliament to levy taxes, so that the king on his own could not levy taxes. He needed Parliament's authority to do so. So Parliament proceeded to pass in 1764, the year following the great victory over the French and the Spanish, the Currency Act. Now, the Currency Act, which makes a lot of sense from the British point of view, said that the only currency in the British colonies now would be currency issued by the British government. Up to this time, the currency was British pounds and British money, or rather colonial money, from South Carolina and New Hampshire and New York. Each colony had effectively issued their own paper money. And the key thing to understand about this is two factors. Paper money is not what you and I think of paper money today. We think of paper money as being backed by the federal government. And perhaps you remember, and we were old enough to have remembered, when on the dollar bill it said the United States guarantees the payment of silver for the dollar. And there was very little what was called specie, what they meant gold and silver in the colonies. So what the colonies did on their own was to issue their own money, which they would repay. Well, that meant you had 13 different currencies here, in addition to British pounds, which really made commerce difficult. So all of us, I think, have been abroad at one time or another and had to exchange our dollars into local currency, and there had to be currency exchange rates. And imagine now where Massachusetts merchant is selling goods in Georgia and he wants payment in Massachusetts dollars, and Georgia doesn't have dollars, or the local person can only give him Georgia dollars. So from the British point of view, to enhance commerce and to establish uniformity made great sense. To the colonists, however, it meant taking away from them an authority that they had to control their own economy. The colonists at this time did not think of a continental economy, they thought of the economy of the colony. So the colonists, for example, in Virginia, when they sold tobacco, it was shipped to London. It wasn't shipped to New York for sale. So they felt, with some justification, that power and authority had been taken away from them arbitrarily or without their consent. And that's a word that we'll keep coming back to throughout the history of the American Revolution: consent, and whose consent is necessary for actions that governments take. But it wasn't just the power to declare all of the local currencies illegal. It was also that the British had decided that what they were going to do is they were going to crack down on smuggling. Now, smuggling exists when people don't want to pay taxes, tax evasion, and smuggling was on the customs duties that were due on imported British goods that came into the colonies. So it was very easy with a coast like the coast of America, with all its rivers and harbors extending 1,500 miles, for a local merchant, instead of paying customs duties if he came to the port of Philadelphia, to go down to Chester, unload his goods, and scram out to sea. And it was widespread. Well, the British felt that here was a way just to enforce the law. The law is you have to pay customs duties when you come in. People are evading the law. We can raise more money just simply by enforcing the law. What they decided to do, however, is they decided to create what was known as vice admiralty courts. Well, that's a long-winded way of saying that it was courts which were without a jury, so that if there was a charge of you being caught smuggling, you were brought to this court where the British appointed judge made a decision as to whether or not you were guilty. It wasn't an adversarial proceeding. And the interesting thing that the British did is they located the single Vice Admiralty Court in Halifax, New Hampshire. I beg your pardon. In Halifax, Canada. So that meant that for you to defend yourself, you had to pay your way to Halifax, Nova Scotia. I think Halifax is Nova Scotia, isn't it? To go to Halifax to be judged by a British judge without a jury of your peers. This wasn't, in colonial eyes, an act manifesting a willingness, or a desire rather, to raise revenue by enforcing the customs laws. This was an act that deprived Englishmen of their God-given Magna Carta right to a trial by jury. This kind of court didn't exist in Britain. It only existed here in the colonies. Now, there had been a history of vice admiralty courts, which is way off on a tangent, but had basically been involved in capturing other nations' ships and deciding who got the money from selling the goods on the ships. But this vice admiralty court was designed to render unto the British authorities the exclusive power to determine the guilt of and innocence of somebody who was charged with a crime. And to skip ahead to what I may never do is a talks on the Constitution. If you read the Constitution and the rights in the Constitution to trial and trial by jury, you will see that this immediately created among the colonists a suspicion that in fact there was something more going on here than simply an attempt to raise money. So throughout the colonies, there were protests about these vice admiralty courts. Additionally, in 1764 also, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act imposed additional customs duties and taxes above and beyond what had pre-existed on such items as wine and sugar and iron, which were imported. Remember, if you would, what I had spoken about in an earlier talk, that the trade from New England to the Caribbean islands where the sugar was grown was a trade based on the sugar coming into New England and being used to make different kinds of wines and spirits, particularly rum, which was then shipped out. So if you now raise the tax and the duties on sugar, that means that the industries in New England in particular, which were designed to produce rum and sell it in Britain and in Europe, were crushed because they couldn't pay the additional fees for importing sugar. The other thing that was in the Sugar Act was the additional duties on iron. It wasn't so much iron, it was the fact that the colonies had almost no finished goods that were the result of manufacture. This was the time when the incipient beginnings of the manufacturing revolution were occurring in Britain. It wasn't the Industrial Revolution in 1764, but it certainly was the beginning of control by Britain over manufactured goods coming into the colonies. So these two acts now drew a response from the colonies. The belief that the British had that these acts were only slight changes in the status quo, that they were mild and that they would be readily accepted. That the legitimacy of Parliament's levying these acts was not to be questioned, because that's what Parliament had always done. Parliament had raised taxes and regulated foreign trade, and trade all over the world had to go in British ships. So, for example, even before the 7 Years' War, French ships couldn't come to the colonies. They had to go to Britain, sell their goods in Britain, and then the British ships had to take that French silks and merchandise to the colonies in British ships, not in French ships. So these were measures designed to raise revenue, designed to enforce the law. There was no anticipation in Britain that there would be any significant problems. But that was not the reaction in the colonies. And one of the themes I raised with you last time in the last talk is this inability to talk to each other, or more profoundly, the inability to understand the other party and what they were trying to achieve. What you had then is you had the rise of conspiratorial implications to what the British never thought of as conspiring to destroy colonial rights. But when looked at from the colonial perspective, they looked to the colonial charters, to the charters that had been given to William Penn or signed in Massachusetts, or the charters that had been given by the kings and approved for 150 years, where the colonies raised their own money, raised their own taxes. This was at that point in time about 150 years of colonial assemblies running the finances of the colonies, whether it was the House of Burgesses in Virginia, or the General Court in Massachusetts, or the Pennsylvania Assembly. These were the normal way that colonials saw their government and saw that taxes were raised, money was issued. This is what they lived with 150 years, based not simply on that tradition, but based on the colonial charters. And as Englishmen, they felt that they had won, or their ancestors had won, the definitive right to a trial by jury. So when the Vice Admiralty courts were created, it seemed legitimately like an attack on the most precious rights that Englishmen had: the right to a trial by jury and the rights to their own property. And as we discuss more and more the development of the American revolutionary idea, you will begin to see that there is a conflation of two words: liberty and property. To the colonists, property became the touchstone of their concept of what liberty is. The right to their property as determined by them. The right to control meant the right to have the power to determine. They looked at the French and Indian War and said to themselves, our militia had fought alongside the British regular troops. Our militia died and spilt blood and was wounded just as well as the British regular army had been. We, the colonists, in our colonies, by our assemblies, raised funds to pay for our militias to fight against the French and their Indian allies. It's not as if this was gratuitous on the part of the British government and the British Army. I'm not sure I had mentioned, but you may know that Washington was a colonial militia officer who fought with Braddock and suffered defeat initially at the hands of the French, and then went back and helped the British troops win other victories in Western Virginia and Western Pennsylvania. So the colonists could not really understand why they were not given any credit at all for the effort that they had made, both financial and in manpower and losses to their fellow colonists. They could not comprehend the validity of the claim to abolish their control over their own property and over their own finances. And they began to see it as an attack on their liberty as Englishmen. They began to see, or think they saw, a threat to the fundamentals that they had previously enjoyed. And there was really a uniform response throughout the colonies. Now, I'm not suggesting that Georgia was as vehement as Massachusetts, because Massachusetts was the most vehement in protesting. But there was uniformity in the understanding that they were at risk of losing their powers. They were, throughout the colonies, determined to make known the fact that they had objected to this kind of what they deemed to be arbitrary control by the British government. The other fact, and I had mentioned it, the retention of the British Army here raised the fear of a standing army. Now, again, projecting 50 or 70 years into the future at this point, the American government, when it was formed under the Constitution, under the Confederation absolutely, but under the Constitution, kept the army de minimis, minuscule. The American army virtually did not exist in the War of 1812. It was all militia. And the thought was that a standing army was a threat to property and a threat to liberty. It was a threat to property because if the British troops were in town, the British officers could command you to open your house to what was called quarter, Q-U-A-R-T-E-R, to quarter or keep troops in your house for which you were given no compensation and for which you had to provide them with food and housekeeping and the rest of it. So a standing army, 10,000 troops when the French were gone, seemed to the colonists, again, another idea of some conspiracy against their rights. Now, the vehemence of the response, both to the Currency Act and, I'll discuss in a moment, the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act, was mobilized by the creation of something that was very different than had existed before, and that was called committees of correspondence. It began in Massachusetts, as a great many of these revolutionary ideas began, when somebody suggested, I think the folks down in North Carolina would be interested in what's going on up here. Well, let's organize ourselves and start writing letters. And who would they write letters to? Some relative they knew or some official in the local government. And so rather rapidly, all of the colonies created very unofficial committees of correspondence. And they began to exchange information on a basis that had not been done before, a basis that was roughly contemporaneous. Now, I say roughly, there was no Twitter, Instagram, Facebook kind of, but by sea, there was an ability to move up and down the coast correspondence. And all of a sudden, somebody in New Hampshire says, oh my God, somebody in Maryland's thinking the same thing I'm thinking. Maybe we ought to get together and protest. In addition to which, they started to write to their delegates, and I'm going to define that word in a minute, in London. The colonies, most of them, employed people who lived in London generally to facilitate trade between that particular colony and Britain, or to call Britain's attention to the fact that there were Indian attacks at Fort Pitt, and they ought to send the army there. The most famous of these representatives was, I'm sure you're not going to have much problem guessing, our friend Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin came over the years. He lived in London for 20 years. He had left his wife behind here in Philadelphia and moved to London and lived there for 20 years. And his primary job was to represent the colonial interests. He had no governmental role. He had no say in what was going on, but he was allowed to converse with the British government officials on an informal basis to express the concerns that were being felt here. So to some extent, the British started to get a sense that the keeping of troops here in the colonies, that the creation of these acts to deprive the colonies of the currency, ability to have their own currency, the creation of vice admiralty courts, and the concept of the unlimited authority of Parliament were causing problems in the colonies. Now, one of the things that was going on here at the time is that the British government did not have what later became called a colonial office. There was no high official who had a specific responsibility in the cabinet for colonial affairs, whether it was in the Caribbean or here or Canada or India, wherever it was. It was more or less the responsibility of what was called then the Board of Trade, because the colonies were thought of as really places to enrich Britain through mercantilist theory. And mercantilist theory said colonies exist to enhance the wealth of the mother country. And that which the colonists do for themselves is okay to the extent that we don't have to pay for it. But the goods they create, really, which were natural resources, lumber, stuff like that, are all to be sent back to the mother country. So the goal of mercantilist theory, which was prevalent at this time, was the colonies were subservient economically to the mother country. But it was all about trade, really, and to fight the French, you sent the army, but you didn't have anybody to really run the colonies. And I mentioned previously, and I want to recall for you, that the governors of the colonies over the 150 years really were British elite or royalty or minor royalty who was sent here, who knew very little about colonial life before they got here, and who did not see themselves as responsible to reflect to London what the realities of the situation were. Their job, they saw themselves, is making sure that the British Army was taken care of, that smuggling was suppressed, the duties were collected, and they stayed for 2, 3, 4 years and stuck their hand into the till more often than not and went back to London. So there was a lack of understanding of what was going on in the colonies. So on the British side, there was no conscious effort to suppress the freedoms of the colonies. It just never occurred to them that there were freedoms to suppress. The mindset in Britain was so disjointed as to what was going on here that when protests occurred, the first feeling that they had is, oh, those common folk, those low, and we've talked about this before, the lower class people who live there, the Americans, oh, all right, get them to shut up. And we'll do something to get them to shut up. And what happened was, the British reacted by repealing some of these acts. So they repealed the Currency Act to the extent that it created vice admiralty courts, and they didn't enforce it. So they had some sensitivity to the extent that what they were trying to do is keep things calm. So I'll pick up here going back, I guess, a little bit. The colonial reaction was unexpected in Britain. They did not see the colonies as places that they had rights to protest. So what you get is you begin to get the colonies not understanding what the British were doing, developing conspiratorial theories. At the same time, the British were so separated from the realities here that their policy became totally reactionary. And the attempt by the colonies through the committees of correspondence, through the Virginia Resolves, through protests from Massachusetts, from talks that Franklin had with some of the governmental authorities, still were ineffective in the sense of bringing the colonies together. There was an attempt by some colonies to create a Stamp Act Congress after the Stamp Act was passed, and that turned out to be a fiasco. So what was happening, therefore, is what I tried to emphasize, an issue that was about who had the power to act, and was that power unlimited? And the theory in Britain was the power of a unitary government, the power of Parliament, and the theory in the colonies was somewhat different. And one final point or two final points to make. As the British had a very clear understanding of their theory of the power of the king and Parliament as being a unitary power, the idea that the colonists had was amorphous. It was not fully formed. They did not know what they were later to assert in 1776. What they knew was that colonial charter rights were being attacked by this series of legislation, and they had not come together any kind of a clear ideological picture of what Americans wanted, except leave us alone and don't make these changes. So the final point is that at this time, in the 1760s, it was very clear that even the most radical of colonists, and I use Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, John's cousin, still professed loyalty to the king and still saw their loyalty to the king as required and by the terms of being Englishmen, and their wish to still be close to Britain, but objected to what they saw as the arbitrary assertion of unitary power. They did not think in terms of the United States. They did not think in terms of independence. So the conflict became, this conflict in the early 1760s became a festering point between the colonies and Britain. Thank you. No, thank you. Right. Okay. So do we, the only person in this room who's wearing a mask is you. You're afraid they're going to fine you or something. Your wife is obviously much smarter. Anne.
So I was interested in these committees of correspondence.
Yeah.
The way they communicated.
Right.
But there were newspapers.
Yes.
So were there sentiments of actually turned out to be sedition could not be printed and spread by newspaper? It had to be private?
No. Thank you for saying that. There were, and I think I had mentioned this in an earlier talk, huge numbers of newspapers. When you think of a newspaper, you're thinking of 10, 20 pages. A newspaper could be this sheet and then the reverse side, or pamphlets. There was one scholar who actually went and read over 1,000 pamphlets. There was a constancy of that. What was new were the committees of correspondence. That was different. That was new. But there was a huge amount being written in all of the colonies about these acts, some of which were just completely supportive of the British point of view. It wasn't that, we have a rebellion going here. But what was different was at this time, what the committees of correspondence.
Oh, I'm so interested.
Stan,
what was different about the colonies as opposed to Canada, India, Australia, who all seemed to accept the British, you know, running their countries, where we didn't?
I'll try to do this as briefly as I can. In Canada, the people were French Catholic. And in 1770, I think it was 1770, the British passed what was called the Quebec Act. When I was a kid, I used to call it Quebec. Then I was corrected. The Quebec Act gave authority to the Catholic Church in Quebec. It was an extraordinarily radical act because Catholics in Britain, including Ireland, were prohibited from voting, prohibited from holding office, and they were required to go to the Anglican Church in their town. The Quebec Act won over the French Canadians. So there was no reason for them to revolt. They were now given the authority to use French with French culture and their own religion. The Caribbean islands really had no British population. The Sugar Islands were actually the wealthiest part of the British Empire, not in terms of total volume, because that was the American colonies, but per little island that produced sugar. But the people who lived there, the owners of the plantations lived in London, and they had managers. So the colony there could be 95% slaves. As to India, the British at that time really didn't have colonies as such. They had a commercial organization called the British East India Company, and the East India Company was quasi-governmental, and they tried at that point in the 1760s and 70s and 80s to work through the Muslim rulers, the Muslim rulers of most of India, because the British at that point were based on basically 2 points, Bombay and Calcutta. And again, there were not very many British people there, and obviously there were scores of millions of Indians. And in Africa, there was really very little in the way of colonial settlement except at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. The other British colonies in Africa really were slave trading stations. And in South Africa, the majority of the population that was European origin were Dutch, and they became Afrikaans, as we now know them. So there was very little British population there.
Question. Yeah. What about taxes for maintaining the army? Were in these other colonies or
That was basic.
They accepted the fact that they were taxed for the armies, et cetera?
Yeah, the British East India Company had its own army, okay? So the British regular troops didn't exist except for the officer class. And the British East India Company paid for the British officers to live there. There was virtually no British military presence in the Caribbean except at a couple of these islands where they would have a fort to fight the French or the Spanish. There was almost no other place except in Canada. And there, the British Army, to the extent that they were there, were going to fight the Indians or help their people, the French people, against the Indians.
Well, we were the richest colony and the first, the biggest, right?
I'm sorry, say that again.
America, yeah, was the richest and the most important part of the colonial empire at that time, of the British Empire.
It was, the Sugar Islands were the wealthiest per capita, because when you thought of per capita, you excluded African slaves. So when you had a sugar plantation and you had 2 overseers and their families and 800 slaves, you're talking about the 5 or 11 British people. But they produced huge wealth for Britain. The difference here was, by the time of the Revolution, there were 2 million people living here, almost all of whom, with very minor exceptions, were descendants of people who lived in Aberdeen and Dublin and London. They were all British. So what existed here was the same British people as existed in Britain. The difference here, the profound difference, is that for 150 years, the colonies had been left alone. Go up and govern yourself. I don't have to pay for you if you're governing yourself. So why am I going to get involved? Who cares what you do? I don't care. Oh, you're British? That's great. And send me your lumber and send me your tobacco and send me your rice. And that's wonderful. I mean, and I'm going to send you manufactured goods.
Which we would pay for.
Which they were going to pay for. In addition to which, it turned out that the British would rip off the colonists. If they were going to sell an iron pot in London, I'm making this up, of course, an iron pot in London for £1, it was going to cost £2.50 in Virginia. I know some of it was transportation cost, but it wasn't 2.5 times. So the colonies in America, who cares? I mean, how am I, as a cobbler in Bristol, England, going to care very much about some Indian attack on Fort Pitt?
Plus, we had our own militias. I mean, we fought back ourselves.
All the colonies had their own militias. That's why I raised the point last time. All of the people, virtually everybody, had their own weapon. And it wasn't only folks out in the frontier, because the frontier, now it might not be on Chestnut Street, but yeah, down in Delaware County or up in Berks County, that was the frontier. So everybody then was trained as militia. They trained locally in the little town. They got together with their weapons and they paraded back and forth and figured out how to fire the weapon. It was a real constant threat. You know, the horrific, and it is horrific, stories of these massacres we see, God knows, way too much in, where was the last one? I don't know. Atlanta, or what?
Right
Yeah,
now?
the shootings. I mean, that's violence. But that's a violence in a population of 330 million people. It stands out because it's so unusual. There, it wasn't that way. You know, the Indians attacked, they would kill 20% of the population of a town. So you needed to have militia.
Hey, that's-
Anything else?
Other questions?